and I asked, "Do you have anything to say to me?" "Father." He trembled. The room fell dead silent. That was the man who threw my pregnant mother out into the rain while she was carrying me. 25 years later, he came back, no power, no name. No one even remembered him. And the most shocking part, I was the one who handed him a cup of water. If you think this is just another ordinary family story, you're dead wrong. Hit subscribe now so you won't miss any of the deeply emotional stories we're about to tell. It started the night my mother was thrown out, carrying me inside her. Under the furious roar of the Accra rain, the city seemed to dissolve into silver lines. Thunder cracked like the sky itself was angry, and water ran in thick ribbons down the narrow, uneven sidewalks. Street lamps flickered through the deluge, casting ghostly reflections across puddles that swallowed up the footsteps of the night. And through this trembling downpour, she moved slow, deliberate, exhausted. Aisha. She was no longer just a woman. She was a storm sheltering another storm. Her belly was round, swollen with life, wrapped in a drenched green wrapper that clung to her skin like regret. One arm cradled her stomach protectively, the other searched blindly for something, anything to hold on to. Her breath came in gasps, her sandals slapping the pavement in uneven rhythm as contractions whispered early threats. Her scarf had long slipped from her head, her hair sticking to her face like vines. But it wasn't the rain or the contractions that had broken her down. It was what came before. Just hours earlier, the house she called home had turned on her. The memory returned like a knife, sharp and unjust. Kelvin had stood in the center of their living room, suited in expensive charcoal wool, the air conditioning humming behind his spine. He looked like ambition incarnate, neatly shaved, cologned, with power framed by degrees and awards on the wall behind him. Aisha had just folded his shirt. She'd set his tie on the table, humming the lullaby her mother used to sing in Hausa. There was pepper stew on the stove. The child in her belly had kicked earlier that morning. She thought perhaps he was beginning to recognize his father's voice. But then Kelvin spoke, and the air left the room. "I can't do this anymore." Her smile, bright like the dawn after Harmattan, faltered. "I'm sorry," she whispered, standing still like a deer about to be struck. I said, he repeated slower this time, colder. "I want a divorce." The word hung there like smoke, thick, suffocating. Aisha blinked. The folded shirt slipped from her hands. "Kelvin." "What are you saying?" Kelvin adjusted his cufflinks, didn't look at her. "I've been accepted into the board. This life I'm building, there's no space in it for you." She stepped forward, hand instinctively on her stomach. "But I'm your wife. I'm carrying your child." He finally met her eyes, and what Aisha saw there wasn't cruelty, it was calculation. That was worse. "And what exactly does that mean?" He said, voice even. "You think being my wife makes you equal to me? You're the daughter of a tricycle driver, Aisha, a roadside mechanic. You grew up serving bean cake by the roadside. I overlooked all of that because I thought you were grateful. I thought you'd stay in your place." Tears began to sting her eyes. "You promised me we'd grow together, that my background didn't matter. You said—" "I said what I had to say," he interrupted. "But now things have changed. You've become inconvenient." She reached out to touch his arm, desperate. "Please, for the sake of our baby." He stepped back. "I'm marrying someone else." The words hit her like fists. Kelvin continued, voice flat. "Amafi is educated. She's cultured. She's the daughter of Chief Boadu, head of the largest civil engineering firm in the region. Her family will open doors for me in ways you never could." Aisha dropped to her knees. "Kelvin, please. I gave you everything. I stood by you when you had nothing. Remember the tiny apartment in Osu? The instant noodles, the broken gas cylinder, I was with you." He looked down at her. "And I'm grateful. But that chapter is closed. Pack your things. I want you gone by tonight. Gone." In one sentence, he had ended a life they built together. Back in the present, the rain intensified. Lightning illuminated her tear-streaked face as she passed a closed kiosk and stumbled into a pothole. She gritted her teeth, clutching her stomach, breath hitching. The child kicked again, angry or afraid, she couldn't tell. People passed her, barely sparing a glance. A few muttered chai, but no one stopped. Pregnant women in the rain weren't rare in Accra. Tragedy was ordinary here. She reached a narrow alley between two buildings barely lit. Her legs buckled. The ache in her back screamed louder than the thunder. She dropped to her knees. Her fingers pressed to the wet concrete. She was soaked to the bone, shivering, teeth chattering. Her breaths came shallow. The world spun. "Help," she whispered, voice cracking. "Somebody." And then came the sound of footsteps, measured, deliberate. From the curtain of rain emerged an old man. He wore a faded wax print shirt under a heavy coat too big for his frame. A thick gray beard framed his face, and round wire spectacles sat crooked on his nose. His umbrella, a wooden-handled thing, sheltered his body, but his eyes held the calm of someone who had lived through worse storms than this. He didn't speak at first. He just looked at her, the kind of look that sees beyond the moment, beyond shame, beyond circumstance. He knelt beside her slowly. "You're going to catch pneumonia," he said softly. Aisha could barely respond. Her lips trembled. She didn't have the strength to argue, didn't even have the strength to cry. The man reached out, offered her his umbrella, then took off his coat and wrapped it around her. "I've seen many nights like this," he murmured. "But something tells me this night is different." Aisha tried to speak, but failed. Her body leaned into him, out of necessity, her mind barely holding on to consciousness. The man supported her gently, respectfully, like one would lift a sacred text. "My name is Kwabena," he said as he began walking her out of the alley. "I own a small bookshop. It's not far. It's dry. You'll be safe." She wanted to protest, but her feet couldn't move without him. Her arms clutched her belly. The child kicked once more, and so they disappeared together into the storm. An old man with a history behind his eyes, and a woman with a future beneath her ribs. Neither of them knew that tonight, in the lowest valley of her pain, the roots of destiny were quietly being watered. In a city that often forgot the weak, a forgotten bookshop would become the unlikely cradle of a new beginning. Behind them, the city roared on. Rain kept falling. But in the space between thunder and silence, something quietly shifted. The beginning of a storm is loud, but the beginning of healing, that always starts in a whisper. Under the low hum of the storm outside the bookshop, felt like a world apart, musty, dimly lit, and quiet, in a way that seemed almost sacred. The smell of aging paper lingered thick in the air, mingling with the scent of wet soil from the shoes they'd left at the threshold. Shelves towered from floor to ceiling, stacked with stories in cracked spines and faded ink. The rain tapped against the windows like an impatient drummer. But inside, time was slower, softer. Kwabena had cleared a small patch on the floor between two low shelves, placing a tattered mattress, hardly more than a cushion really, over a woven raffia mat. He wrapped Aisha in a woolen blanket, the only clean one he owned, and placed a basin of hot water beside her. Her breathing had become irregular, her face pale and tight with pain. She tried to sit up, but collapsed backward with a gasp. "Don't move too fast," Kwabena said gently, crouching beside her. "Your body is working. Let it." She nodded weakly, her lips trembling, hair damp with sweat now instead of rain. Her hand pressed instinctively against her belly, fingers shaking. Another contraction hit her like lightning, and she cried out, short, sharp, and helpless. Kwabena didn't flinch. He moved like someone who'd once known responsibility well, though it had been years. He lit a lantern, casting a golden hue across the narrow room. Shadows danced along the bookshelves like silent witnesses. "I've never done this before," Aisha whispered through gritted teeth. Kwabena smiled warm and cracked like his voice. "Neither have I. But I've read a great many books." That made her laugh for just a second. It was absurd, terrifying, and strangely comforting. He had boiled water on the old kerosene stove in the corner. Towels, clean though frayed, were folded neatly on a tray. His hands trembled only slightly as he wiped her forehead. "You'll be all right, my dear. Just hold on. Your child is almost here." Aisha's eyes widened. Another wave of pain hit longer this time. She gripped the edge of the shelf beside her, toppling 2 books to the floor. Titles tumbled, Roots of the Baobab, Voices of Ghana's Women, Rebirth and Revolution. The irony was not lost on her. Her breathing turned ragged. Sweat beaded on her lip. "He left me," she gasped. "He threw me out because of who my father was." Kwabena gently placed the damp cloth on her neck. "Then he never knew who you are." The pain swelled again, tearing through her like a storm within a storm. She screamed this time, a guttural sound that tore into the silence of the shop, shaking dust from the rafters. But outside, the rain swallowed it whole. Kwabena stayed by her side, unshaken. "Push, Aisha," he said, voice steady. "You're not alone." She pushed, and in the space between lightning and thunder, between breath and exhaustion, the first cry of a child rose into the air, thin, high, and defiant. Aisha collapsed backward, tears pouring down her cheeks, in absolute silence. Kwabena lifted the child covered in the wetness of birth, writhing furious at the cold world it had been pushed into. With gentle hands, he cleaned her, wrapped her in a scarf Aisha had brought from her village, a soft kente print red and gold, and placed her in her mother's arms. "A girl," he whispered, strong and loud already. Aisha stared at her daughter like seeing sunlight for the first time. The child's eyes were shut tight, fists clenched like she was born ready to fight. Aisha's tears came harder now, not from pain, but from awe. She kissed the tiny forehead, her voice a breath. "Eliana," she murmured, "you will not be forgotten." Kwabena sat beside her, watching the storm outside begin to ease. "That name, it means God has answered, doesn't it?" She nodded. He did, in the most unexpected place. They sat like that for a while, the 3 of them surrounded by silence and stories and the soft sighs of new life. Then, after a long moment, Kwabena spoke. "Would you like to know something, child?" Aisha turned to him. Her eyes were tired, but they held a flicker of curiosity. "What?" "I once had a child," he said, staring not at her, but through the window past the rain into memory. "A son. Bright. Brighter than I was. He loved physics. Said he wanted to build bridges across Africa." "What happened?" she asked quietly. "I said too many truths in the wrong room at the wrong time," Kwabena replied. "The regime didn't appreciate university lecturers who told their students to question power. I was arrested, detained for 2 years. By the time I came back, my wife had remarried. My son no longer recognized me." He chuckled, but it was hollow. "They told him I was dead. Perhaps in some ways I was." Aisha's fingers tightened around Eliana. "I'm sorry." Kwabena turned to her, smiling again, but this time there was pain behind it. "It's all right. Sometimes life writes its own chapters, whether we like them or not. But perhaps, just perhaps, this bookshop still has one more story to tell." Aisha looked around. The shop was crammed with forgotten volumes, philosophy, history, poetry. She saw a copy of Things Fall Apart perched beside the fire next time. Old worlds whispered from every direction. "You could have sold all this and lived well," she said. "I could have," he agreed. "But stories are the only wealth I trust now." The lantern crackled, casting shadows against the walls. Eliana stirred in her mother's arms, yawning her tiny fingers, stretching out to the ceiling like she was reaching for something not yet written. In that moment, Aisha felt something she hadn't known since Kelvin shut the door in her face. Hope, not the grand, soaring kind, not the stuff of fairy tales, but something slower, realer. The kind that comes when someone stays, when someone chooses kindness, when the world doesn't. "I don't know how I'll do this," she whispered. "I have nothing. I'm nobody." Kwabena reached over and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You have her, and that makes you somebody important." She looked down at her daughter, and right there, as the rain eased into a drizzle and the smell of morning soil began to rise, Aisha made a promise. I will not let this world break her the way it tried to break me. I swear. Her voice was raw, honest. A vow made not to the heavens, but to the blood in her arms. Kwabena leaned back against the bookshelf, sighing as if a weight had shifted inside him. Then you and I, he said, we are the same. Carriers of unfinished stories. But now perhaps we get to write them differently. They stayed like that until dawn. 3 souls adrift now, anchored in the shelter of words, warmth, and a fragile unspoken faith that, from ruins, something worthy could still rise. Under the faint amber glow of a kerosene lantern, the little bookshop took on a second life each night. While the city outside roared and tumbled through the chaos of modern Ghana cars, honking radios blasting Azonto beats, mothers shouting curfews down alleys, inside this shop time moved with grace. There were no digital clocks, no blaring headlines, no Twitter storms. Just paper breath and the soft rustling of pages as the wind found its way through the wooden shutters. Aisha worked tirelessly during the day. From dawn until dusk, she moved like an invisible current through the back streets of Accra cleaning offices before workers arrived, washing clothes for strangers who barely looked her in the eye, carrying water jugs for a few cedis. Her feet were often cracked, her hands raw, but her spirit was something else entirely. Because each time she walked through that crooked bookshop door and saw Eliana curled on the floor between the shelves, nose buried in a book thicker than her arm, something inside Aisha healed a little more. Eliana was not like other children. She didn't babble. She inquired. She didn't just listen. She absorbed. At 4, she could name 5 different types of stars. At 6, she had already dismantled Kwabena's broken radio, then reassembled it so it picked up channels the old man thought long gone. Once she asked Kwabena why the books smelled different in the rain. He answered her with a lecture on cellulose and the emotional memory of paper. She listened like she was born to carry wisdom. She had no toys. Instead, she had transistors, screws, coils, and dreams. Kwabena had gifted her his old physics textbook on her 7th birthday. It was tattered, highlighted beyond recognition, half of it in German. She read it like scripture. A week later, she came to breakfast and asked Uncle, "Do you think black holes dream?" Kwabena had chuckled so hard he nearly choked on his tea. "If they do, Eliana, you'll be the one to understand them." But for all her brilliance, she never knew her father. It wasn't that Aisha refused to speak of him. It was more like she carefully stepped around his ghost, like a broken stair on a wooden porch. She avoided the subject with surgical precision. She deflected with warmth, with stories, with food. But children are naturally drawn to the unsaid. It was a Sunday. Rain pressed gently against the shop windows, the kind of drizzle that made people lazy and books smell older. Eliana was 10. She had just finished reading To Kill a Mockingbird and looked bothered. She sat on the wooden floor, her knees pulled to her chest, a pencil tapping her lips. "Mama," she said. Aisha was sweeping the back room. She paused, her broom catching on a loose tile. "Yes, baby." "Where is my father?" The question came softly. No blame, no bitterness, just a void needing shape. Aisha froze. For a moment, the only sound was the broom handle slipping slowly from her hand and hitting the floor. She turned slowly, eyes meeting Eliana's. The child was too sharp to be deceived, too old in spirit for fairy tales. Aisha walked toward her and sat down on the floor beside her, their backs against the bookshelf. The rain continued its slow percussion. She didn't answer immediately. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, twisting her wedding ring, one she no longer wore but somehow always felt. She looked at the window, watching as water streaked down the glass. "You know how some storms," she began, "don't come to destroy, but to cleanse." Eliana tilted her head. "Yes." Aisha turned back to her eyes, moist but steady. "Your father was a storm I wasn't ready for. But you were the rainbow that came after." "Does that mean he's dead?" "No," Aisha said quietly. "But for us, he doesn't exist. And you, Eliana, are the most beautiful thing I've ever made from pain." The girl said nothing. But she didn't press again. She simply leaned her head onto her mother's shoulder, and they stayed like that, tethered together by silence and shared breath. Later that night, Eliana returned to her radio parts, but there was something slower in her movement. A shadow of knowing. Kwabena saw it too. When Aisha stepped out to collect water, he sat beside Eliana, who was adjusting a copper coil with surprising dexterity. "Your mother," he said, "has walked through fire." Eliana didn't look up. "I know. But she walks like water." She nodded. Kwabena placed a hand on her back, his voice lowering. "There's a thing this world will try to take from you, child. Not just your money, not your mind. It will try to take your softness. It will make cruelty look clever. Power look important. But don't fall for it." She finally looked up. "The world broke me," he continued. "I used to teach ethics and law at the University of Gazana. Lectured about justice, held rallies, wrote essays that made the papers. Thought I was untouchable because I had a voice. What happened? One night I was taken from my home, blindfolded, beaten, locked away for 712 days. No charges, no court." He stared ahead. "They said I had incited rebellion, that I had made students too aware." Eliana's hands paused mid-twist of wire. "When I came back, no job, no son, no wife. Just a pension and this shop full of ghosts." He turned to her. "You asked me once why I kept all these books if no one reads them." She nodded. "They're what's left of my voice, and maybe now they'll be the start of yours." Eliana blinked something behind her eyes, stirring. She went back to soldering wires, but this time her touch had new purpose. That night, Aisha watched her daughter sleep, long limbs tangled in worn sheets, her breath soft. The light from the moon pooled through the window, dancing across Eliana's face like a blessing. Aisha whispered a prayer in Hausa, one her own mother used to murmur, when they had nothing but groundnut soup and dreams. She kissed Eliana's forehead and walked quietly to the bookshelf, where she pulled down a notebook. Inside she began to write. "She will not carry the shame I was given. She will be raised with pride, with intellect, with fire. She will question things, break them open, rebuild them. She will know justice not as theory, but as bloodline. She will be the storm they never saw coming." And in a tiny bookshop on a narrow street in a city that rarely remembers the poor, a girl grew up surrounded by stories, not the kind bound in hardcovers, but the kind lived in silence, sacrifice, and stardust. The kind of stories that make revolutions. Under the golden chandeliers of East Lagan's most coveted estate, Kelvin lived like a man who had finally become what the world told him he should be. The house was glass and marble imported wood, Moroccan tile Italian faucets. It sat like a monument to arrival. Even the driveway shimmered in the morning sun, a polished arc that led to a pair of German-made cars parked like trophies. From the outside, everything was perfect. Inside, the rot had already begun. Kelvin now bore the title senior partner at one of Ghana's most influential law firms. He was sharp, eloquent, charming his suits, tailored his shoes, silent killers on polished floors. His name sat on donor plaques, at conferences, on scholarships for young lawyers, on the lips of men with oil in their wallets and blood on their contracts. They said he was the new Ghana, young, ruthless, efficient. He let them say it, let them believe he'd pulled himself up by brilliance alone. But buried beneath the luxury, beneath the frame degrees and the carefully curated wedding photos with Amafi, was a blueprint of betrayal. Kelvin had mastered the game, and he played dirty. He had learned early that rules bent for men who had power and shattered for men who had friends in the right ministries. And Kelvin was always at the golf course, always at the gala, always at the funeral of someone important's uncle offering a donation, just large enough to be noticed, but not questioned. Amafi, his wife, was the daughter of Chief Boadu, the largest contractor in West Africa's road development sector. She was raised with crystal spoons and French tutors, her world shaped by chauffeurs and silent staff. Yet she wasn't naive. Her grace was curated, but her mind was razor-wired. She studied psychology in London, read contracts like novels, and had learned from her mother that in politics and marriage, listening in silence could be the deadliest move. At first, she adored Kelvin's ambition. He was different from the lazy trust fund boys she had rejected. He had fire, precision, hunger. But over time, she noticed that hunger had no bottom, and that scared her. It started small. A misplaced envelope in his briefcase filled with cash. A deleted email that lingered in the trash folder. A conversation in the hallway she wasn't supposed to hear something about clearing squatters before a luxury project broke ground. She didn't confront him, not yet. Amafi had learned the moment you ask a man like Kelvin a question, he becomes a lawyer in his own defense. So she played the long game. She began to notice patterns. The way he paused before answering certain calls. The way he looked away when the news reported another violent eviction. One evening, while they were dressing for a charity gala, she asked him casually, "Is the Riverside case still tied up?" Kelvin froze for a fraction of a second. No, it was dismissed last week. No claim. But she knew better. She had read the court order just that morning. Still pending. That night, she slipped a voice recorder no bigger than her thumb into his briefcase. Kelvin, as always, made calls from the car. He didn't trust drivers with secrets. Only silence and leather. That night, she listened from her laptop upstairs as he chuckled over the speakerphone. "Yes, yes. The file is ready, but we need to grease the gears at Lands. The clerk will want the envelope. I'll send Quasi to handle it. Make sure the chief doesn't speak to the press. If he resists, send in the team. Burn the stalls if you have to. By Monday, the site must be cleared." Silence. A sip of something. "Oh, and tell the radio station to drop that NGO segment. Offer them airtime next week. Positive spin only." "Got it." The call ended. Her fingers were trembling. This wasn't just corruption. This was violence. Kelvin had become an instrument of displacement, uprooting the poor like weeds so the rich could lay concrete. Amafi sat in the dark for hours. How had she not seen this man fully before? How had she been so foolish? She remembered Aisha only faintly, the girl Kelvin had once dismissed with a smile. She was sweet, he had said. But she had no pedigree. Now Amafi realized it wasn't about pedigree. It was about power. And the moment a woman posed a threat to his ascension, he erased her, just like the families now being chased from their homes. Just like the street vendors whose stalls were mysteriously burned in accidents. That week, she installed surveillance software on his laptop. She didn't need all the evidence. She only needed enough. Enough to show his firm, enough to drop in a journalist's inbox, enough to make the law devour its own mouthpiece. And all the while, she smiled across the dinner table. They toasted their shared empire, took photos at fundraisers, slept under Egyptian cotton. But she was no longer his wife. She had become his shadow, his reckoning. Kelvin had no idea, because men like him never look behind them until it's too late. Under the heavy heat of a dry Harmattan morning, Accra woke to headlines that rippled like gunshots. Corruption in the courts, senior lawyer exposed in land grab scandal, evacuations tied to bribery network revealed. Kelvin Mensah under ethics committee probe. His name was everywhere. TV stations cycled through news loops, images of makeshift homes being bulldozed, recordings leaked with Kelvin's unmistakable voice instructing clear it. Quietly. "We don't want blood, but if it happens, it happens." The internet did what it does best, flayed him open meme by meme. The same photo of Kelvin in a tuxedo at the Justice Gala was now layered with bold red text, "The face of our rotten system." One viral post called him the Smiling Reaper of East Legan. He watched it unfold from behind the bulletproof windows of his office on the 18th floor. Alone. Phones rang, but not with congratulations. Calls from colleagues were clipped cautious. The managing partner left a voicemail. "Kelvin, we're suspending you indefinitely pending review." Even Amafi didn't come home that night. He waited. Midnight came. Then 3 a.m. Silence. No text, no explanation, only an automated bank alert. She had transferred their joint account into her private one. By sunrise, her wardrobe was empty. Kelvin returned home to find the house hollow. Her perfume gone. Her rings placed on the kitchen island next to the keys to the Lexus. She hadn't written a note she didn't need to. Her silence was her verdict, and it was final. Kelvin stood in the middle of the living room, floor-to-ceiling windows, behind him a view of the city he'd once ruled with a smile, and felt something primal claw its way through his ribs. Not grief, not rage. Something heavier, something slower. Panic. He barely made it to the bathroom before vomiting into the marble sink. The next few days blurred. He was called into disciplinary hearings. The firm distanced itself. One partner shook his hand quietly and said, "We always knew, but damn, Kelvin, we didn't expect this." His name was scrubbed off the company website within 48 hours. Clients walked. Sponsors pulled funding. His honorary panel position at the Law Reform Commission was suspended. Police began circling subtly questions about bank transfers, emails, property seizures. His assets were frozen pending investigation. The house Amafi's father's gift was repossessed. The luxury car impounded. His former driver Kwesi now worked for someone else. No one answered his calls, not even the interns he once mentored. In less than a month, the empire Kelvin had built on charm connections and ruthlessness had crumbled into ash. He rented a single room in a forgotten corner of Nima low ceilings, flickering fluorescent light, no AC. He shared a bathroom with 4 strangers. He slept on a mattress with springs that bit into his back like memory. He stopped shaving, stopped eating properly. He drank sachets of gin during the day and stared at the ceiling at night. For a while, he tried to pretend it was temporary. He kept his blazer hanging by the door, told himself he'd return to courtrooms soon. He still wore his wristwatch Rolex worn leather strap, but even that began to lose meaning. Then one afternoon, he looked at himself in the mirror. Truly looked. The man staring back at him was not someone he recognized. His eyes were sunken, skin gray. The sharp jawline he had once sculpted with pride was now softened, sagging from nights without sleep. His lips cracked from dehydration, his nails dirty, his scent old sweat and stale defeat. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, his hands limp between his knees. And for the first time, Kelvin thought of Aisha, not with the disdain he once dressed in like a suit, not as the poor girl from Chore Corps he had tried to erase from his life, but as a woman who had looked at him when he had nothing, who had smiled at him with belief, who had shared banku and sardines when all he had were dreams and borrowed courage. He remembered her holding his hand on the night he got his first job offer. Her eyes lit with pride. He remembered her laying beside him on a mattress in a shared compound flat, whispering, "We will make it. Together." He had thrown her out in the rain. Pregnant, alone. He had forgotten her, until now. His hands shook as he reached for the sachet of gin beside his mattress. He stared at it, but didn't drink. Not yet. Instead, he opened the drawer. Inside was a tattered copy of the Constitution, a gift from a professor long ago. He flipped through it, not reading, just touching, trying to remember what justice had once meant to him, what the law had once been before it became a ladder to climb over people's lives. He closed it, and for the first time in weeks, he cried. Not the kind of tears that come in court for dramatic effect, not tears of anger or manipulation. Real, unfiltered sorrow. They poured out of him, unstoppable. He wept for the man he had been, the man he had become, and the bridge between them that had collapsed. He wept for Aisha, for the child he'd never met, for the empire he built on bones. And when the crying passed, he lay down, not to sleep, but to think. He began to ask himself questions he had spent a lifetime outrunning. Who am I without the suits, the firm that claps? What is success if it leaves you empty and alone? And maybe the most dangerous of all, if Aisha had forgiven him back then, could he ever forgive himself now? The room was quiet. The fan hummed. Downstairs, someone argued about politics over a transistor radio. Outside, children laughed, oblivious to the ghost of a man upstairs counting the years he had wasted in pursuit of a name that now tasted like ash. Kelvin curled into himself, smaller than he'd ever been, and let the silence answer him back. Under the saturated sun of a bustling Saturday in Accra, the air buzzed with the scent of waki roasted maize and restless ambition. Near Jamestown's edge, a crowd gathered under a peeling canvas tent where volunteers moved quickly with ladles, crates, and lists. This was Eliana's Saturday ritual. She stood at the center of it all, clipboard in one hand. Sleeves rolled her locks, pulled into a high knot. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, just a navy polo with the white emblem of the Attoquabena Justice Foundation embroidered over her heart. The name wasn't accidental. The foundation had been her promise, her legacy. A fusion of tech and justice built on the ashes of her mother's pain and the wisdom of the old man who had raised her like his own. It offered legal aid to evicted families, built digital tools for land rights, and today handed out warm meals to those the system had long forgotten. She'd coded half the intake system herself. She'd sat in on every court session. She knew what it meant to fight without privilege, to speak for people who were always told to stay quiet. She lived purpose like it was oxygen. Water, someone asked faintly. Eliana turned. He stood a few feet from the queue, barefoot, dusty, and sunburned. His clothes were torn, hanging off a skeletal frame. Beard, patchy lips, dry skin, leathery from too many days under the unforgiving sky. But it wasn't the poverty that caught her attention. It was the eyes. They were wild, yes, but in that chaos was something familiar. She narrowed her gaze. Of course. She moved to the cooler, filled a paper cup, and handed it to him. His hands shook slightly as he took it. Their fingers brushed. He looked up. She looked back. Something shifted. The old man's lips parted, but he said nothing. His voice had dried up in the well of shame. For a moment, the world dulled. The street noises fell back. Her heartbeat slowed, as if trying to remember a rhythm from years ago. His gaze rested too long on her jawline, on her eyes, on the tilt of her chin, like seeing a photograph come to life. She stepped back, slightly unsettled by the weight of his stare. "You okay, sir?" she asked gently. He blinked quickly. "Yes. Yes, thank you." She didn't believe him. Most of the homeless who came for food had hunger in their bellies. This man had hunger in his soul. "Sit here," she said, gesturing to a plastic chair under shade. "You can rest. We'll get you something warm." He hesitated, then sat. His knees cracked. He exhaled like it hurt to breathe. Eliana went back to the line, but couldn't shake the image of him. The way his eyes tracked her, almost afraid to look too long, yet unable to look away. Something in her chest twisted a pull she didn't understand. By the time the distribution ended, the man was still there, silent, watching. She approached him with a warm bowl of beans and plantain and a bottle of water. "You from around here?" she asked, kneeling in front of him. He nodded faintly. "Sort of." "Name?" A pause. Then Kwesi. A lie. But it was all he could manage. "Well, Mr. Kwesi," she said, "you look like you haven't had a bed in a while." His throat moved like swallowing pain. She stood. "We have a guest room at the center. It's not much, but there's a bed, a fan, and a clean shirt. No pressure. But if you want it." He looked up. Tears welled in his eyes before he could stop them. "Why are you helping me?" She shrugged. "Because someone once helped my mother, when the world had forgotten her." He froze. That voice, that sentence. Something inside him cracked a soundless shatter. She turned to leave. "Come if you're ready." And he did. The ride to the center was quiet. Kelvin sat in the back seat of the van, eyes flicking between the road and her reflection in the rearview mirror. Every feature etched itself into his brain, her high forehead, the mole under her left eye, the way her fingers tapped the steering wheel to an invisible rhythm. He had never seen his daughter. But in that moment, he was certain this girl was his blood, and it terrified him. Inside the center, she gave him a towel, soap, and a change of clothes. "You can stay for a few nights." "No pressure," she said, trying not to study him too closely. But the feeling gnawed at her. The lines on his face, the cadence of his thank you. It was like hearing a song she couldn't name but somehow knew all the lyrics to. He didn't speak much, but as he showered, dressed, and sat on the clean bed, Kelvin felt something strange shame wrapped in mercy. That night, Eliana sat at her desk, sorting case files when she found herself pulling up a photo. Her mother. Younger, leaning into the frame with a shy smile, one arm wrapped around a man in a cheap suit. She zoomed in on his face and froze. The same eyes. She turned slowly to the hallway where Kwesi lay in silence behind the guest room door. She didn't know who he was, but the storm in her blood had begun to stir. Something she knew was coming, and nothing would be the same again. The next morning, Accra bloomed slowly in a haze of morning dust and far-off car horns. The Justice Center's corridors were still quiet. Volunteers had yet to arrive, and the sun was just beginning to paint the city's rooftops gold. Inside Eliana's small office, the only sound was the quiet hum of a ceiling fan and the occasional page flip. She sat at her desk, her coffee untouched fingers scrolling through the pictures taken at yesterday's food distribution. Most of them were standard smiling volunteers, tired but grateful beneficiaries, kids licking grease off their fingers. But then she saw it. The shot had been accidental, taken by one of the junior staff, slightly blurred, but enough. There he was, Kwesi, sitting alone in the corner under the tent's edge, a cup of water in one hand, his eyes fixed directly on the camera. And again, that feeling. Like déjà vu mixed with vertigo. There was something about his gaze, about the shape of his cheekbones, the downturn of his eyes, the slight cleft in his chin. Something she saw every time she looked in the mirror, every time she looked at the photo of her mother from 25 years ago. She didn't hesitate. She picked up her phone and called. "Amma," she said as soon as her mother answered. "Can I come over?" Aisha's voice was still laced with sleep. "Is everything all right? I need to show you something." An hour later, Eliana sat on the couch of the modest but warm apartment her mother had moved into after Kwabena's passing. The scent of tea and dried herbs filled the room. Framed quotes hung on the wall in both English and Hausa. "Do not fear the night, it is where the ancestors whisper." Eliana pulled out her phone and held it out. "This man came to the foundation yesterday." Aisha leaned forward, adjusting her reading glasses, and looked. She didn't blink. She didn't speak. She stared. Her hand rose slowly, covering her lips, her chest rising with a breath she didn't know she'd been holding for 24 years. Her fingers trembled. "Eliana," she whispered, her voice cracking. Eliana sat up straighter. "You know him." Her mother nodded slowly, like a ghost had walked into the room. "That's your father." Time fractured. "What?" Aisha turned toward her daughter, her eyes suddenly glassy, full of years she never meant to share. "His name is Kelvin." "No." Eliana shook her head. No, that can't be. That man, he's a wreck, a drunk. He's nothing. That he can't be my father." "I knew it the moment I saw his face," Aisha whispered. "I prayed I was wrong." Eliana stood abruptly, pacing. Her chest burned. "That man, he didn't even have shoes on. He barely looked me in the eye. You're telling me that's the man who threw you into the rain while you were pregnant?" Aisha didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her silence said it all. Eliana clenched her fists. "And now he's just walking around my foundation like he belongs there, drinking our water, sleeping in our beds. How long have you known?" "I didn't know until now," Aisha said, her voice barely audible. "He vanished from my life before you were born. I never told you because I didn't want you carrying his stain." Eliana's mouth opened, then closed. "I didn't want your first understanding of love to be betrayal." Aisha continued. "I wanted you to grow up knowing kindness. So I let the storm pass and built a home from its wreckage." Eliana sank into the couch. The room suddenly too small, too bright, too full of truth. "I let him live," Aisha said after a pause, "but I never let him back in. And now, I don't know." Eliana wiped a tear from her cheek angrily. "I should have known. I felt something when I looked at him, like staring into a part of myself I didn't want to recognize." She laughed bitter. "Is that what blood does? Betray you quietly?" Aisha reached for her hand, but Eliana pulled away. "You should have told me. I wanted to protect you." Eliana stood. "No. You wanted to protect your version of me. The girl who didn't ask about the gaps in her story." Her voice rose, cracking under the weight. "I needed truth, not fiction, not a fairy tale where I magically came from nowhere. I needed to know who he was, what he did, what he chose." Aisha bowed her head. and now you know. The silence between them expanded like a wound. Eliana moved to the window, watching rain clouds gather in the distance. The sky mirrored her storm. She hated him. She didn't even know him, but she hated him. For the pain he caused her mother. For the silence he let grow between them. For showing up now broken, expecting redemption like it was something on a plate he could ask for seconds of. And yet, that wasn't what he had done. He hadn't asked for anything. He had sat in silence, shame draped around his shoulders like a funeral cloth. He had thanked her, carefully, respectfully. He had watched her like a man who wanted to speak, but no longer believed he had the right. And now the image of him, tired, fragile human, would not leave her. Was that justice? Letting him rot? Letting him vanish again? She didn't know. "I can't do this," she whispered. "You don't have to decide anything now," Aisha said softly. "You're allowed to sit in the discomfort." Eliana turned. "Did you ever forgive him?" Aisha smiled sadly. "I forgave him the moment I stopped needing him to suffer." Eliana let the words hang, heavy, truthful. "Then why do I feel like I want to tear him apart?" "Because some legacies we inherit are made of fire. But you don't have to keep burning." Eliana swallowed the lump in her throat. She wanted to scream, to cry, to rage. Instead, she picked up her phone, staring at the photo again. And she knew what she had to do next. Not for him, for herself. The auditorium at the University of Ghana was packed. Rows upon rows of students, activists, faculty, and community members buzzed with anticipation. The banner behind the stage read in bold, unmissable letters, "The Law, Justice, and Forgiveness, Reimagining Power and Mercy in Ghana Today." Beneath it, a smaller inscription shimmered under the spotlights, hosted by the Otto Kwabena Justice Foundation. Eliana stood backstage, her fingers gripping the edges of the lectern notes she no longer needed. She had rehearsed the words 100 times, but tonight wasn't about performance. Tonight was confrontation. The room dimmed. A round of polite applause carried through as the MC introduced her. She stepped into the light, a spotlight cutting through the air like a verdict. Kelvin sat in the last row, wrapped in shadows, wearing a donated jacket that didn't quite fit his shoulders. His beard was trimmed thanks to the center, and he sat with a posture he hadn't owned in years. But his hands trembled. The moment Eliana's voice rang through the microphone, his chest tightened. She didn't look at him. Not yet. "Good evening," she began, calm but firm. "Tonight is not just about law. It's not even about justice in the way we've come to define it through punishments, verdicts, or constitutional reform." She paused, scanning the crowd. Her voice softened, but it carried. "Tonight is about something much harder, much quieter. It's about forgiveness." A murmur rippled through the room. Some leaned forward, others stiffened. Eliana moved from behind the podium. "I want to tell you a story," she said. "A true story. One I carry every day." She walked slowly along the stage, letting the silence build. There was a woman, brilliant, gentle. The kind who could look at a storm and still hold hope in her hands. She fell in love with a man who said all the right things, made all the right promises. Her voice didn't shake, but her fingers curled slightly at her sides. They were young, hungry for a future. She believed in him, so she followed him, even when he was still nothing but ambition in a rented suit. Kelvin closed his eyes. He knew. But one day, when the man got a taste of power, he saw her not as his partner, but as his past. Something to hide. Something to shed. A hush fell over the auditorium. No one coughed. No one moved. She was pregnant when he turned his back on her. Threw her out into the rain, like she was debris from a life he no longer wanted to remember. Eliana looked out beyond the crowd into memory. She found herself on the streets that night. Cold, broken, alone. But she wasn't defeated. She turned back to the audience, her face lit by the spotlight, her eyes fierce. She gave birth to a daughter on the floor of a dusty bookshop, helped by a stranger who had every reason to stop believing in humanity, but chose not to. Whispers stirred now. Murmurs of recognition. Some students sat straighter. Eliana's voice rose. That child grew up surrounded not by privilege or comfort, but by stories, by resilience, by people who chose kindness when they had nothing else to give. She grew up to believe that justice is more than courtrooms. It's how we treat those we no longer need. She paused. The room held its breath. I was that child. Gasps, then silence again. Kelvin's hands gripped the plastic seat beneath him. And tonight, Eliana continued, I have invited someone here who by all accounts should not be. Now she looked directly at him. Kelvin froze. In the back row, she said, pointing, there sits a man who once had power, who once stood in rooms like this and believed he was untouchable. He made decisions that destroyed lives, not with guns, but with signatures, with silence, with rejection. Her voice did not waver. And he is also my father. A collective inhale passed through the crowd like a wave. Kelvin's head dropped. I asked him to come tonight. Eliana continued walking slowly toward the edge of the stage, not to humiliate him, not to seek revenge, but because this stage, this moment, is about truth. And truth, she said, requires confrontation. She turned, walking back to center stage. So I offer him a choice. I offer us a choice. She looked out again, eyes landing on him like a gavel. Mr. Mensah, she said, would you like to say something? The room turned as one. Every head, every camera, every breath. Kelvin stood slowly. The old stiffness in his legs was nothing compared to the quake in his chest. He stepped into the aisle. His shoes echoed too loudly. He stopped just beneath the edge of the stage. She stepped down. They were face to face for the first time, not in shadows, not behind veils of silence or social stations, but in the full weight of history. He reached for the mic she held out to him. She didn't pull away. The metal was cold in his hands. His voice broke. He tried again. I do not deserve this moment, he said. A pause. But that woman, my daughter's mother, she was the greatest mistake I ever made. Not in meeting her, but in leaving her. He looked at Eliana. And you are the proof of everything I could have been, if I had chosen courage over ambition. The room was still. I cannot undo the past, he said. But I am here because I believe in her, and I believe in what forgiveness might rebuild, even if it's too late for me to live in it. He handed the mic back. Eliana took it, and the audience erupted, not with applause, but with stunned silence. Because real power, they realized, wasn't in the man who once ruled the courts. It was in the girl he left behind, and the woman she had become. The room didn't breathe. The silence that followed Kelvin's words wasn't empty. It was thick, dense, filled with the weight of everything unspoken between a father and the daughter he never knew. The truth had been laid bare not as spectacle, but as offering. And still Eliana did not look away. She stood inches from him on that stage, the microphone hanging loosely in her hand. Kelvin's eyes, red-rimmed and unfocused, seemed smaller now, like a building stripped of its facade, all steel beams and weakness. No defenses, no charisma, no title. Just a man finally standing in the rubble of his choices. He turned to her. His lips trembled before any words came. I was wrong, he said, voice low, almost hoarse. I don't have a speech. I don't have a reason that can untangle what I did. He raised his head slightly, forcing his gaze to meet hers. You were born into a storm I created. You grew up building boats out of what I abandoned. And here you are, carrying more grace than I ever earned. His shoulders dropped. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I needed you to hear me say it. From the part of me that's still human. He paused, his throat tightening. Then came the words that didn't ask, didn't manipulate, just fell out like they'd been trapped for decades. I am sorry. Not the lawyer's version of apology, the kind that bruised, the kind that left nothing hidden. Eliana stood very still, her face unreadable. Then she took one breath, and another, slowly. You're not the first person to say sorry to me, she said softly. But you're the first one I've needed to hear it from. Kelvin blinked rapidly, trying to hold the tears. She continued, voice steady. I'm not here to give you peace. I'm not here to heal you. What you do with your guilt is your business. A pause. I'm here to free myself. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a small card, plain white, with a single embossed address. She held it out. Kelvin stared at it like it might burn him. "That's the Redemption House," she said. "It's a rehabilitation center. They work with ex-convicts, the unhoused former addicts, but only the ones who want to rebuild." He looked at her stunned. "I don't know what you do after this," she said. "I don't know if we'll ever speak again. But if you truly meant a word, you said start there. You build something that isn't built on someone else's suffering." He took the card with both hands like it was sacred. His lips quivered, but he didn't speak. He knew better now. Behind them, unnoticed until now, stood Aisha in the dim light at the back of the hall. She hadn't planned to come. She didn't want to relive the rain, the betrayal, the hollow years of silence. But something in her heart had told her this chapter wouldn't close unless she saw it. And now there she was, watching the man who had broken her body and soul finally crumble on stage under the weight of his own truth. She didn't step forward. She didn't speak. She just let the tears fall slow and quiet, not of pain, not even of sadness, of release. For all the time she'd pictured this moment, imagined slapping him, screaming, demanding answers, what came instead was stillness. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel vindicated. She felt lighter. It wasn't justice she had waited for all these years. It was a simple sentence, "I am sorry." And now her daughter, born from the wreckage, stood firm and free in the light. Strong enough to extend mercy, not as a reward, but as a boundary. Aisha turned and left before anyone could see her. She didn't need to witness the applause that would surely follow. Didn't need to explain herself or be pulled into another press story. She had done the hardest work in silence. Carried life when no one else cared if she lived. Raised a girl into a force. And now at last, she was closing the chapter. Not with revenge, but with peace. On stage, Kelvin clutched the card in both hands, like it was the only proof that something of him could still be salvaged. He nodded once toward Eliana. "Thank you," he whispered. She didn't respond. She didn't need to, because this wasn't about him anymore. It never really was. Eliana stepped back toward the microphone, her voice calm as she addressed the crowd. "We are all descendants of something broken," she said. "What we choose to pass on next, grief, rage, or redemption, is ours alone." And just like that, the story shifted not into forgiveness as gift, but as rebellion. And for Kelvin Mensah, a man who once mistook power for worth, this would be the hardest lesson yet. The truest strength doesn't shout. It simply refuses to hate. 5 years later, Accra shimmered with the quiet, steady rhythm of progress. Not the kind plastered on billboards or echoed through election campaigns, but the kind that grew brick by brick in quiet corners often unnoticed. In a sun-drenched building tucked into the heart of Lebon, a sign hung above glass doors. Imara Solutions, where code meets justice. Inside, Eliana moved through open-plan halls buzzing with energy. Coders in Ankara shirts worked side by side with legal advocates and urban planners. On one end of the room, a digital interface mapped disputed land boundaries in real time. On the other, a chatbot helped users navigate small claims court filings in 3 local dialects. Eliana stood at the center, not just as CEO, but as something more elemental, a North Star. Her presence wasn't loud. She didn't need to be. The foundation of this empire wasn't built on charisma or inherited power. It was built on firewood memories, late-night hunger, her mother's soft singing over kerosene stoves, and the relentless belief that technology wasn't for the privileged, it was for the silenced. Beside Amara's headquarters, nestled beneath a flamboyant tree with crimson blossoms, sat a building that hummed with a different kind of magic. The Kwabena Community Library, named not for fame or funding, but for a man who had once handed a blanket to a girl in labor and placed a newborn into her arms, while rain pounded against broken shutters. The library's shelves were lined with more than books. They held notebooks of dreams, handwritten poems from children, declarations of rights by farmers from the north, engineering diagrams drawn by barefoot boys who came just for the AC, but stayed for the hope. Aisha, now gray at the temples, but still sharp-eyed, ran the space like a sanctuary. She wore glasses on a beaded string and kept a kettle boiling all day. When children asked why it was called Quabena, she would smile and say, "Because some people write change with a pen, and some do it with a warm meal and quiet hands." Meanwhile, in another part of the city, far from the buzz of innovation and the comfort of renewal, Kelvin scrubbed down a tiled hallway in a quiet center for re-entry and recovery. His hands, once manicured to perfection for courtroom theatrics, were now coarse from labor. But he didn't mind. In fact, it soothed him. The Redemption House was not glamorous. It didn't have sleek logos or hashtags, but it saved lives in quieter ways. Men who had burned bridges, slept on thin mattresses, and woke to routines that asked them not who they had been, but who they still could become. Kelvin had arrived there as a shell sent not by the court, but by his daughter, and somehow that made it harder. The first few months he didn't speak much. He scrubbed toilets, he served food, he folded linens. He took their anger, their judgment, and made no protest. Then one morning, a young man in his 20s cornered him in the kitchen and sneered, "You were that lawyer, right? That big shot that let people rot so you could rise." Kelvin looked at him, then nodded. "Yes, I was." There was no pride in it, no shame either, just fact. From that moment, people stopped whispering behind his back. They asked him for advice instead, on job interviews, on writing apologies, on how to speak to daughters they had disappointed. Kelvin didn't know how to fix them, but he showed up every day sweeping the steps, listening, offering silence when that was all he had. And once a month, he wrote a letter, not poetic, not dramatic, just pages of reflection. He never sent them with expectations. He sent them because he needed to. Like a man carving small boats from memory and floating them out into the sea, not knowing if they would ever return. Eliana read them all, sometimes at night after long meetings and harder decisions. She would find one in her mail pile, always in the same handwriting on plain stationery. He never asked to meet, never apologized again, never claimed more than he deserved. One letter simply read, "I saw a man today who reminded me of the boy I used to be before ambition swallowed him. I told him to be kinder than I was. I hope he listens." She would fold the letter, place it in a box labeled Kelvin, not forgotten, and breathe. No rage, no shaking hands, just breath. She didn't invite him to Amara. She didn't ask him to speak at panels. She didn't reintroduce him into her life like a healed limb, but she forgave him in the way that mattered most, quietly, fully, without fanfare. Some days she wondered if he still held the cards she had once given him, if the corner had frayed, if he ever reread her words in the silence between midnight and dawn. And even though she didn't write back, he knew. He could feel it in the gentleness of the center's staff, in the fact that no one called him by his past, in the way the young men he mentored began calling him Uncle K without irony. He had not reclaimed his old life, but he had built a new one. One evening, as Eliana locked up the Amara offices late, she walked past the wall of staff portraits and paused in front of the first one. Hers. She smiled, then looked up out the tall glass window. Across the street, the lights of the Quabena library glowed warm. Inside, her mother was reading to a group of children seated in a circle, their eyes wide, mouths open in awe. And far beyond that, in a quieter pocket of the city, her father folded a letter and placed it in an envelope marked, "To the one I almost never knew." He would send it tomorrow, not to rewrite history, but to honor the seed that had grown from water and pain, from silence and rain. Forgiveness, after all, wasn't about planting something perfect. It was about watching what grows in broken soil when the storm finally passes. The rain began like a whisper, soft, gentle, the kind that taps lightly on window panes as if asking permission to come in. Eliana sat by the open window, the warm breeze carrying the scent of earth and jasmine. Her laptop glowed in the dimness of the room. The screen filled with a single title centered on the first page of a manuscript, "The Dream in the Rain." She stared at it for a moment, her fingers hovering above the keyboard. Then slowly, purposefully, she began to type. My mother was not raised to lead revolutions. She was not taught the language of lawsuits or the science of resilience. She knew only how to endure. But in enduring, she taught me everything I would one day need to build a world that had room for someone like her. She paused. Her reflection in the glass shimmered against the black sky outside, and beyond it, the faint image of the rain hitting the garden stones danced like memory. The book wasn't about her, not really. It was about a woman who gave birth in the middle of a thunderstorm. About an old man who handed out books and grace in equal measure. About a girl who grew up wrapped in stories instead of safety. And about how all of them, in their own way, had chosen love over bitterness. It was about survival, but more than that, it was about rebirth. Downstairs, the sounds of laughter rose from the veranda. Eliana closed the laptop, gently pushing it aside, and made her way out of the study. The veranda was lit with warm yellow lanterns, strung across wooden beams. The rain drizzled beyond the edge of the roof, a curtain of glistening silver. The scent of roasted peanuts and fresh-baked bread drifted from the kitchen, mixing with the petrichor. Aisha sat in a cushioned rocking chair wrapped in a shawl, watching the rain like it was an old friend. Beside her sat two children, Eliana's niece and nephew, huddled beneath a thick kente blanket, giggling as they made shadow puppets on the walls. Kwabina's portrait hung just inside the doorway, above the bookshelf Aisha had built with her own hands, filled with titles he once lent, lost and loved. Eliana stepped outside. The porch creaked beneath her feet in a familiar way, like it remembered all the nights she'd sat there as a child, wondering where the rain went when it stopped. Aisha looked up and smiled. Eliana. She crossed over and knelt beside her mother's chair, resting her head gently on Aisha's knee. The rain picked up, just a little tapping faster on the aluminum roof. But it wasn't the storm kind. It was the kind of rain that brought mango blossoms and clean breath. Aisha took Eliana's hand, her thumb rubbing circles into her daughter's skin. "You've become more than I ever dreamed," she whispered. Eliana looked up, eyes glowing. "Because you dreamed me, Mama. You kept dreaming even when the world told you to stop." Aisha smiled. Her voice trembled, but not from weakness. "You are proof," she said, "that even from pain, hope can grow. That even from betrayal, something beautiful can be born." Eliana swallowed. The lump in her throat had waited years to form. And you, she said, gripping her mother's hand tighter, "are the reason I could forgive. The reason I knew that forgiveness wasn't for them, it was for me." They sat in silence for a moment. Just mother and daughter, the old and the new, the wound and the scar that no longer hurt to touch. "Did I ever tell you," Aisha said after a pause, "that the night you were born, the rain fell just like this?" Eliana nodded. "You tell me every year," she said, smiling. Aisha laughed. "Then let me say it again. It didn't fall to drown us. It came to baptize us, to cleanse the past." Eliana rested her head on her mother's shoulder. I think it worked. Behind them, the door creaked open. A young woman, one of the Amara interns, stepped out, her face glowing from the light behind her. "Eliana," she called gently. "There's a call from the UN rep. They want you on next month's panel." Eliana raised her eyebrows. "Let them wait. Tonight I'm just a daughter." The intern smiled and nodded, disappearing back inside. The children chased each other around the posts of the veranda, their bare feet slapping against the wood, their laughter louder than the rain. Inside the kitchen, lights flickered. Someone turned on a radio, and the soft sounds of Ebo Taylor's highlife melodies drifted through the walls. Aisha looked over at Eliana, her eyes sparkling. "You'll finish that book." "I'll finish it," Eliana said. "For you, for Kwabena, for me." Aisha nodded, squeezing her hand once more. "Then the rest of the world will know what I've always known." Eliana looked out into the rain, breathing in the scent of wet hibiscus. "That forgiveness," she said softly, "is the only thing that lets us keep dreaming." The camera would slowly pull away then, drawing back through the frame of the porch, past the flickering lanterns and the sound of laughter. Up above the roof beyond the yard, up into the sky where the rain kept falling, not as sorrow this time, but as lullaby. And as the final shot widened, the world below felt softer. The scars didn't vanish, but they no longer stung. The rain had returned not to take, but to give. Not to mark an ending, but to whisper that even after all has been lost, a new dream can still begin.